Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Etymotic Evo. This is Etymotic's latest IM, and a couple of weeks ago we unboxed it here on the channel. I measured the frequency response, but apart from that, I didn't have much to say about the sound of the Evo because I hadn't heard it. But over the past couple of weeks, I've spent quite a bit of time listening to the Evo and comparing it to Etymotic's other IEMs. We're going to talk about the Etymotic ER4XR and the Etymotic ER2XR in this video. But yeah, spending some time comparing them and just really trying to figure out, is this actually an evolution of Etymotic's sound? Or is it just kind of more of the same? Now, the things on paper that are pretty obviously different from Etymotic's other stuff would be the form factor, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit, talk about whether or not the Ety fit is any less of a meme here with the Evo. But the other big difference here is not necessarily just their frequency response target, but also the fact that this is Etymotic's first multi-driver earphone. So both the ER4XR and the ER2, they're single driver earphones, and it's pretty exciting or pretty impressive what Etymotic is able to do with just one driver. But I was excited to find out, does that kind of jump to the next level once they bring in multiple drivers? So just for clarification, the Etymotic Evo is a 3-driver earphone, 3 balanced armatures. It's just an all BA set, no hybrid shenanigans here. And for that, they charge $500, which I guess is another bit of an evolution here. The ER4XR, which came out about 5 years ago, $350 when it first came out. So this is definitely more expensive, although it's already coming down in price. In fact, on Amazon, it seems like it's around $420 right now, which that's not too bad. But yeah, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. So if you're here now live and you have any questions about the Evo or anything else that we talk about, please do drop it in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have a little back and forth conversation, and hopefully I can answer all of your pressing Evo questions. But for now, let's just go ahead and dive into the review of the Evo and start by talking about what comes inside the box, and then give some build quality and fit opinions. So what you have laid out here is everything that comes in the box of the Evo. This is the box itself. It should not be a stranger to you, but anyway, pretty typical package, honestly. You get a little bit of a nice hard carry case. It does seem mostly plastic, or maybe it's metal, I'm not totally sure. But it is at least a hard carry case, and it does have this little foam block in it, which you could actually do without if you weren't interested in using this, but this does help you, I guess, organize the cable. Frankly, not a thing I use. I use these goofy little plastic boxes, but not a bad inclusion there. I think what's actually a little bit more interesting is this little bag. Frankly, I would probably be more likely to use this myself just because it's nice and simple. It's going to fit into a pocket or into a backpack a little bit easier. And it does have this interesting microfiber texture on the back of it, which you could use for wiping your IEMs down. So I think that's pretty nice. You do, of course, also get the requisite set of ear tips, and Etymotic includes both their 2-flange ear tips as well as their 3-flange and then their typical foam tips. And you can tell here the missing pair is the 2-flange, which just suggests that that was the pair that I used for the evaluation. It was definitely much more about fit and comfort and stuff like that, which we'll talk about in a little bit, than it was about sound. If you are curious about how these ear tips maybe affect the frequency response versus the 3-flange ear tips, I do have measurements for those on squig.link with a link in the description if you want to check that out. But apart from that, you also get this, which is Etymotic's pretty typical. There's not a lot to look at, but I'll show you up close anyway. These are Etymotic filters that fit into the nozzles of the earphones. They give you spares because ostensibly these things can get, maybe wet over time as they're inside your ears. And sorry not to get too gross, but yeah, our ears are maybe not necessarily the least moist places in the world. That was a weird thing to say. This here is a little tool for removing those filters, so it's nice that they included that, and they also included a little tie for the cable, which is going to lead us into talking about the cable and talking about the build aspects of the unit itself. And I think it's worth talking about this cable, which is I'm trying very carefully to not get tangled up. During the unboxing, I probably had quite a few things to say about how thin and surprisingly, shockingly thin this cable is. This is It's much thinner than I expected. Frankly, this is a thinner cable than pretty much anything else I've seen on an IM before, especially when you get up here to the earpieces themselves. Just like incredibly thin. And my initial impression of this was that the thinness was a bad thing. You know, people are going to be somewhat concerned about durability of the cable. I'm not necessarily concerned too much about the durability, but for me, a thin cable just means that the handling of the cable might not be the best. I was also concerned about these connectors, which are not MMCX connectors. They are, I thought at the time, kind of a, let's punch it on that so you can take a look. At the time, I thought this was a proprietary connector, but it turns out this is kind of a non-proprietary cable. It's called a T2 connector. And this cable, as it turns out, is made by a company called Linum. I think they're out of Germany, maybe. And the cable is thin on purpose. Like there might be some people, you know, I read the marketing spiel and I was like, okay, there's some benefits potentially to a thin cable, such as low microphonics, which is actually an issue that Etymotics have dealt with in the past. So, and that just means that as the cable rubs up against, you know, your shirt and stuff like that, ostensibly a thinner cable will transmit less of that audio into your ears. And then the other benefits of this is just because it's so lightweight, it is ostensibly, you know, somewhat transparent to wear. You don't really feel it. That's kind of the selling point. And if I'm perfectly honest, both of those selling points, I think this cable actually does deliver on. I did not have issues with microphonics with this cable, whereas as soon as I was switching back and forth with the other Eddies, the difference was pretty clear to me. And the cable is very thin. It does just kind of disappear behind my ears, and I'll give it a fit test in a little bit. But I think it does deliver on that. Now, that said, I still don't like this cable. It is just way too thin, and as you can kind of see, like, it fights me a little bit, right? It's a little bit stiff, it's springy. It doesn't want to roadie wrap and just kind of lay flat without a lot of pretty specific care. So that's one issue that I have with this cable. Let's see if it'll stay in place. No, it's still fighting me. The other issue that I have with this cable is just I get this thing tied in knots so much, more than any other cable I've had. So, you know, I guess I appreciate that Etymotic went with a cable that solved a couple of problems that they've had with previous cables in the past, but unfortunately, I don't think this is the best solution. I found this cable to be a pain in the butt, if I'm perfectly honest. And then the other thing that's kind of a bummer about this cable is that, yes, this T2 connector, it is not proprietary to Etymotic. You can in fact buy spare cables on Linum's website, but they are not cheap cables. The cheapest cable they have is about 80 bucks, and they go up to like 300 bucks or something like that. So definitely, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this cable solution. Perhaps the most interesting solution, and I might go to this route myself, is that Linum actually sells T2 adapters that can take this T2 connector and turn it into an MMCX connector. So ostensibly for around 30 bucks, which isn't too bad, I could turn this ER2 or this Etymotic Evo into an MMCX cable earphone. The other aspect that makes this really light cable kind of a pain in the butt is how heavy these earpieces are. So that's going to lead us into talking about the earpieces themselves. And for the most part, I like the weight. Like, these things feel pretty nice. I was afraid in press photos and stuff like that. I thought maybe it was like a lightweight plastic, but no, these are actually pretty weighty, nice and solid, all metal build. In fact, let me go ahead and pull off the ear tip so you can take a look at the nozzle, which, yes, still quite intimidating, but even this is a metal build. So everything on here is really quite well built. It's just, because of that, it's a little bit heavy, and normally I wouldn't complain about the weight here, but on this really light cable, having a heavy IM with the light cable just kind of exacerbated the issues that I had with this thing getting tangled up and tied up. This is definitely the cable that I spent the most amount of time unknotting. But I guess I was supposed to stop talking about the cable and start talking about the earpieces. So they are kind of a more traditional earpiece design versus what Etymotic typically does, right? They're kind of known for their cylindrical earpieces. This fits just more standard into your concha bowl, but it does still have that very long nozzle. And so I found that, honestly, in terms of fitting this earphone, it really does feel quite a bit like Etymotic's typical fit. If you are at all intimidated by Etymotic's typical fit, I don't think the Evo is a solution, but I'm not too concerned about the typical Ety fit. I've gotten used to it, and frankly, I think you can do it too if you want to. That said, there are some things about this fit I actually think are a little bit more difficult than the fit on the ER4. So the ER4XR, right? Let me actually go ahead and pull in one of these earpieces into view. This is actually the ER2, but the ER2, right? And the ER4, they both have this cylindrical shape. They both fit quite deep like the Evo. But because it's such a small piece, as you're kind of maneuvering it through the ear canal, which is maybe an uncomfortable thing for me to say, but yes, when you fit these things, you are kind of maneuvering it around the bends of the ear canal. There's no issue. This thing is, small. It doesn't take up any room in my ear bowl. That's fine. With the Evo, unfortunately, because of how large this body is, I found it more difficult to navigate this longer nozzle into my ear canals. And it was especially an issue in one of my ears. I think it was my right ear, more so than my left ear. The solution that I came to, a little bit of it was practice, and some of that can be expected, but the real issue, or the real solution, was that I ended up moving to the 2-flange ear tips versus the 3-flange. Not that it fits any less deep into the earphone with the 2-flange tips, but I did find that it navigated my ear canal a little bit better. And I guess I'll give you the demonstration of navigating my ear canal with these, with the Evo. And so the typical fit, let's see if I can try and get this as much on camera as possible. You want to lift your ear and kind of just like push it in there, and then like keep pushing it. And that might not sound very comfortable, and frankly, if I'm perfectly honest, it's not the most comfortable, but once it's there, it fits very, very securely. You can see I've got the linen cable pulled up pretty snug with the ear cinch. And generally, I would say the fit has a couple of pretty positive things to say. Like, the security is above average, way above average. Like, these earphones are not going to come loose with time. I would sleep with these earphones and wake up in the morning, they'd still be in the exact same position, which might sound like a given, but it's definitely not. A lot of earphones will kind of come loose and you have to readjust them over time. No issue with the Etys. The other benefit is that because it fits so deep into the ear canal, sound isolation is above average for sure. Like, if you're using these things on an airplane, or you're sitting on the couch sharing space with somebody else that is making sound, you don't have to worry about audio intruding into your ears that you don't want to, because the sound isolation on these things is so strong. The other thing I'll call out is that was my table. This thing actually fits a little bit more flush in my ear than something like the ER2 and the ER4, which I found meant that this was actually better for sleeping, right? The ER2, ER4, a lot of people wouldn't recommend sleeping in it, but I do sleep in them. But they're not that great for side sleeping specifically, because there's just this thing, kind of the cylinder sticking out the side of your head, and I don't know. This with the flatter fit against the side of my head, I found honestly was not too bad for side sleeping. So I would say the comfort once this thing is in my ear is actually pretty good. The biggest issue that I have with the Evo, and this is honestly true of other Etymotic's other stuff, is that the ingress and the egress, right? Putting it in and taking it out of the ear it takes a little bit more time, a little bit more effort and concentration than your typical IM, but it's also just a little bit more uncomfortable. And so if you're in a situation where you have to take them in and out of your ears, whether to have conversations with people or just hear your surroundings, that can be a bit of a detractor. But again, that's kind of true of Etymotic's other stuff. So I think that is about as much as I needed to say about the physical aspects of the Etymotic Evo thinking. So I think that's going to lead us into talking about the sound quality here on the Evo. And like I typically do, I'm just going to start by giving you an overview of the sound signature while I try to position this thing in a way that is aesthetically pleasing. So you shouldn't be surprised that Etymotic's typical sound signature is neutral, right? If you're looking for a big bassy V-shaped IM, you shouldn't be looking at Etymotic, and the Evo is no different than that. This is still very much a neutral tuned IM, but it is different than the ER2 and the ER4, especially different from the ER4 in my opinion. So the ER4 I would describe as kind of like a warmish neutral, but I don't know. It's very much mid-range focused and but really pretty strong treble performance. Here with the Evo, I would describe this as very much a warm, laid-back neutral. You've got, again, a mid-range focus, but here the treble I would describe as actually somewhat on the dark side. And then in the lower frequencies versus the ER4, there's actually quite a bit more sub-bass emphasis. So this is, again, not a bassy IEM, but there is, especially if you compare it to the ER4XR, there is a bit of a sub-bass boost in there, and I find it actually pretty tasteful. But it does give this just generally a more laid back and a warmer tune versus what most people have come to find to expect from Etymotic. So that's the general sound signature. What do I like about the sound here? And generally, I'll say that tone that I just described, I think is actually really good. I think it's really quite pleasant tone. It's easy to listen to. It works for a lot of music. That warmth that is there in the music, it keeps it sounding neutral, but it keeps it from sounding too analytical, right? This is not like an overly aggressive in the treble, not necessarily like a hit you over the head with treble detail or anything like that. It just gives you this kind of warm, laid back version that's still a mid-range focus and that nice sub bass. So mid-range detail, I would say, honestly, I think is pretty exceptional here on the Evo. I think it's, and when I say exceptional, I'll say it's competitive for sure at the price, right? This is a $500 earphone. It's up against some pretty stiff competition, and I think the mid-range detail actually it hangs in there. I think versus, well, we'll talk more about how it compares directly to the other Etymotics in a bit. And then the last thing that I want to say that I like about the sound here on the Evo is the bass. The bass on this thing is honestly some of my favorite bass. And now, I'm not like a big bass guy, so I don't know what that means to you necessarily, but I think the bass on here is probably the best balanced armature bass that I've heard under maybe like $2,000. And that might sound extreme to even think that there are $2,000 IMs, but there are. But yeah, so generally balanced armature bass, or just, yeah, let's talk about it. All right, there's the comparison would be versus a dynamic driver. A dynamic driver, it's got those characteristics. It's got that bounce. It's got texture. It's got something to it. Whereas balanced armature bass can really commonly kind of come across a little bit weightless, a little bit foofy. Some might even call it farty. But that's what balanced armature bass is kind of known for, just being a little bit bodiless. Here on the Evo, the BA bass is actually pretty exceptional. I love the bass on the Evo. Again, it is not like a super elevated bass. This is not a lot of bass. I think the tonal balance here is just about perfect for my preferences. But a lot of those characteristics that you might attribute to a dynamic driver, I think you could describe here on the Evo. Now, it does still feel like a balanced armature bass. Like, it doesn't feel exactly like a dynamic driver bass, but it does have body, it does have texture, it gives a nice sense of depth to the sound signature and to the sound stage, and it even has a little bit of a kind of a bouncy character in the decay, which I frankly was pretty impressed with, considering this is a 3-driver balanced armature earphone. To deliver bass of this quality, honestly, is pretty legit. So yeah, so I like the mid-range detail. I love the bass on this thing. What are the things on the Evo that maybe I don't love? And honestly, I think that, as much as I like the warm, laid back tonality here, I do think it is lacking in treble. I think it's a little bit on the dark side. The treble quality that is here, I think, is pretty good, but I find that sort of the transient attack on some musical instruments, like let's say guitars, right? And specifically guitars in Cigarettes After Sex, which is an artist I like to listen to. They have this, really tactile feel as the guitar strums that comes from that initial transient attack. But I find that the treble darkness here in the Evo keeps it from sounding, I don't know, having quite that edge. Definition on sound in general is pretty good here with the Evo. It is balanced armature, still pretty fast, and like everything sounds well defined. And you do get a little bit of extra definition versus a single balanced armature, I find. But that little bit of bite that you might get from stronger treble performance, which especially in like the extended treble, that's where I think this thing could really do with some upgrades. Is just the lower treble, mid treble, they're a little bit on the tame side, but I could be pretty happy with them if there was a little bit stronger extended treble performance that I think, again, would bring in that little bit of extra bite to the transient attacks. Now, I think related to that lack of treble, imaging here on the Evo I would describe as kind of average. The staging is generally pretty narrow. It's not as two-dimensional as something like the ER4, but I do find that the sound field is a little bit on the tight side. It's a little bit closed in sounding, although again, I think definition is not bad. Like, it doesn't come across smeary or smoothed over or bloaty or anything like that. It lacks that little bit of bite from the treble. And I think because of that too, you could describe the sound here maybe a little bit on the boring side. A characteristic or a descriptor that came to mind for me was that it sounds a little bit stern. So that is what I think about the sound on the Etymotic Evo, but I'm gonna go ahead and bring in a couple of other earphones to do some head-to-head comparisons. Let me go ahead and throw this stuff to the side, make some room for our competitors, and kind of talk about how these things compare and rank in a couple of different categories. So what I have here is, this is off camera, that is the Etymotic ER2XR, or no, this is the ER4. I've got it on the cable of the ER2, just to make things extra confusing. But this is the ER4, and then I've also got, and I've made a mess of it, so let me roadie wrap it for you here live. This is the Etymotic ER2XR, which I've actually got on the ER4's cable because I think this is a nicer cable, and I prefer the ER2 to the ER4, just to set the stage a little bit. And then the other earphone that I wanted to compare to is the Prisma Audio Azul, which I actually have it out on loan right now, so I don't have it here, but we'll use the case as a stand-in. So Prisma Audio Azul, this is another multi-balanced armature set. This is a 2BA set that's going for a neutral sound signature. I think fairly comparable to what Etymotic does, but Prisma, they did it with multi-BAs before Eddie did. But yeah, these are going to be our competitors, right? And we'll talk about them in a handful of different categories. So we'll start with just describing the general tonality, and I'll talk about how they compare. Ranking them is honestly going to be a little bit hard, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to rank these things. All right. Honestly, my personal preference for just pure tonal balance is going to probably be the ER2XR. It's a little bit on the bassy side for me, but this is like neutral with bass, and I'll be honest, this one is cheating a little bit because I also have the Etymotic brown filters in here, which brighten it up a little bit. I found in the default stock tuning, it was a little bit too warm and laid back, but especially with the brown filters, the balance of treble, mid-range, and bass on this is honestly just pretty standout. Again, maybe a smidge too much on the bass, but I don't know. A little too much bass is probably a little bit better than a little bit too little bass. Next up, I would say probably the Evo would be my next favorite in terms of tonal balance. I think the mid-range and the bass honestly might even be better in terms of their tonal balance versus the ER2XR, but that treble, I do find again that this comes across definitely not a bright earphone, but it comes across with a little bit more brightness in it that I think balances that out a little bit better. And then I will follow up with, I think the ER4XR would probably be my next pick for tonal balance. Like the tuning on this thing is fantastic. It's not my favorite to listen to. In fact, this is probably my least favorite to listen to of the earphones that's on this board. But in terms of tonal balance, it's actually pretty outstanding. Especially the treble tuning is just fantastic. I do wish it had a little bit more bass, but the mid-range and the treble are just about perfect. And then that will leave the Prisma Audio Azul, which I've got it here in fourth place here, but honestly, all of these have, in my opinion, pretty excellent tuning. The difference here would be a little bit less upper mid-range, so a little bit less vocal presence. And my biggest complaint with the tuning here on the Azul was more in that kind of lower treble, where there's a little bit too much lower treble. Maybe with a little bit more of the upper mid-range, could have balanced it out a little bit better, but there's that. Now that said, the Azul is the one earphone here that actually has pretty solid treble extension, so it does have that going for it. But again, I think all four of these honestly have tuning that I love, but if I'm being picky about it, like this is probably how I would rank them. Now, let's change it up a bit and let's talk about Technicalities, which is where this is going to change up quite a bit, if I'm honest. I think honestly, and we'll talk more about the differences, but I think honestly, I think the Evo is my favorite in terms of the Technicalities. You know, this is not a wide staging IM. It doesn't have like especially exceptional imaging or anything on it, but the definition, the detail in the mid-range, the quality and the texture, I'm really pretty happy with here on the Evo. And then again, that bass quality is just to die for. You know, it's definitely not exactly dynamic driver bass, and some people will probably prefer the bass here on the ER2. But my preference, honestly, is I like the bass better on the Evo. I think the bass balance with the tonal balance is better, but even more to the point, like, it just feels tighter. It feels more controlled. I love the bass on there enough that I'm going to go ahead and rank that first in terms of Technicalities. Second up, I'll actually say the Prisma Audio Azul. You know, I think this does lack a little bit in the bass texture, which is probably the biggest detractor in terms of its Technicalities, but I think generally does a really nice job with the image definition, and I think that extended treble is definitely playing into that and just, you know, giving the Azul not an especially wide stage. None of these earphones are like really wide staging earphones or anything like that, but giving it that really nice sharp transient attack on all your different sounds, really nice definition and separation. I think the Azul does phenomenal with that. And then the next up, I'll actually say I think the ER2XR would be my next in terms of technical performance. I think that this one does, you know, it's not the most technical IEM. This is a single dynamic driver. And you can get this thing for under $100. It is definitely the most cheapest of the bunch here. Yeah, if I'm being picky, like the mid-range texture and stuff is not the best. Treble texture, not the best here. But it does, the bass here gives you actually a pretty nice sense of depth. And generally I find this more satisfying than what we'll leave here at the end, which is the Etymotic ER4XR, which actually I think is better in terms of treble performance than the ER2. And maybe even a little bit better in mid-range texture, but this thing is just the most two-dimensional sounding of the bunch here, and because of that I find it kind of boring, and so that's why I've gone ahead and decided to leave this one for the end. I think that the treble on this is maybe the best of the bunch, which usually I would kind of predict would have the best technical performance, but in terms of what, you know, the intangibles that I get enjoyment from, I would rank them actually this way. And then the last category that I'll talk about is sort of just the physical build, the fit, honestly, I think is worth talking about. And the fit, the Prisma Audio Azul will get #1 position, not because this was a phenomenal fitting IM for me. Like, I don't unfortunately have it here on the table, so I can't show you, but this just fits like a more normal IM. It's comfortable, it plugs in without any fuss. Generally, you know, pretty happy with it. Maybe not the most secure fitting in my ears, but not any really big complaints about the fit. And then next up, I would say that the ER2 and the ER4, I mean, they're obviously the same design, so both of these fit me the same, which is to say they actually fit really secure, and I think most people can get used to the comfort. The biggest issue that I have with them is just that putting them in and out of your ears can be a little bit uncomfortable. And maybe even more to the point, it just takes time. So if you are in an environment where you have to take these things in and out of your ears, that can be a pain in the butt. But I don't know, these both fit the same, and maybe it's just because I've had them so long, I've gotten pretty used to how these fit. But that will leave the Etymotic Evo in an unfortunate position where it is last place in terms of fit and comfort. It's basically all of the downsides of the deep fit and like the difficulty of fitting it into your ear, but then plus extra difficulty because of this wide body. You know, the body fits fine in my ear. Once it's in my ear, this is plenty comfortable, but it's the process of putting it into my ear that is just not very comfortable, if I'm being perfectly honest. And that's here with the 2 flange tips. I don't know that I found the 3 flange tips fit any necessary, like they didn't feel that different. I just get a better seal with the 2 flange. But I think that's going to do it for my review of the Etymotic Evo. And you can see this thing, I'm already kind of struggling with this cable and the weight of these earpieces. But That's my review of the Evo, and I know I've said a lot of positive things and a lot of pretty serious complaints, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with this earphone. So out of 5 stars, I'm still going to give it a very solid 4 stars, and a lot of that really just comes down to the sound quality, which I do actually quite love. It's at a price point, $500, where it's up against some really tough competition. You know, here on this table, I compared it specifically to the IMs that I felt were kind of like most tonally competitive with the Evo, but not necessarily in price. If I were comparing this thing on price, right, I'd have to also consider things like the Moondrop Blessing 2, which frankly, I would pick the Blessing 2 over this, but pretty different in their tonal balance as well. And then you also have to compare it to things like the Dunu SA6, the Kiwi Ears Orchestra, the Dunu EST112. There's a lot of competition at $500, and at $500, I think this thing's pretty competitive in terms of just purely sound. If it wasn't for the physical aspects of this thing that I find kind of annoying, I could probably like really fall in love with this earphone. But as it is, I don't know. It's a pretty solid set, but not the one that I would necessarily say is the first one to jump into at $500. So that is the Etymotic Evo. If you have any questions about this thing, again, stick around for the live chat. But otherwise, if you found this video helpful, if you liked it, please do hit the like button down below. It really does help me out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ding that YouTube bell if you want to be part of the next live stream. And I guess I'll catch you on the next super review. And if you're here live, we'll hang out and let's have a little chat. Let me go ahead and give this one more attempt at a roadie wrap so I can set it down. Let's see how that does. Oh, that was my best one of the show. All right, so let me catch up with live chat as best as possible. And thank you all for tuning in, and hopefully we got some good questions. The early shout-outs, Big Boss, Azul, Recode, what's up? Martin Ferreira, how you doing? Always good to see you back. Cheebs, Azul Blue versus Evo Blue. So that actually brings up a good reason why I'm kind of sad I don't have the Evo here on the table. Because I can't show, or sorry, I don't have the Azul here on the table because I can't show the color. I didn't actually notice this before right now, but the color blue that the Evo has is very similar to the color blue on the Etymotic ER2XR, but the Prisma Azul, a much brighter and more colorful and cheerful version of blue, which I gotta say I like. Susiban, yo, how's it going? Nice to see you there. Zaki, what's up? JCap, claiming 3 out of 5, overpriced, and then 2 out of 5. Bold claim. I don't know if that was your prediction or if that was your personal experience. If you've heard the Etymotic Evo, I'm kind of interested to hear some more takes, because that was my take. Curious about yours. Omar saying, wow, that did not roadie wrap well at all. And it does. I would say, you know, here we got a pretty decent roadie wrap, and I would say my roadie wraps are maybe 50% with the Evo. On a good day, about 50%. The other thing that's a really, it's hard to show this in a video because I can't recreate. But when I put these things inside the box, the carry case, or, you know, I put these down for any amount of time and then I come back to them. Like, if I don't pick them up very carefully, I have to be like very careful about picking them up from the earpieces and making sure that I don't have it tangled up. Otherwise, this thing just really does get tied into knots, right? So I'm demonstrating it here, and you can see, look at that. Look at that good old knot we just tied right there. I've spent so much time untying the Evo cable. So, Etymotic, not a big fan of this cable, as much as it is apparently a fancy cable. And some people, you know, it was interesting. There was somebody on the Discord server that popped up and said that they were actually a big fan of the Linum cable. They had good experience with it, that it lasted them for years. So again, I'm not too worried about the durability necessarily. It's just more about the handling and what it's like to live with, and I'm not a big fan of it. Big Boss, I'm calling 4 out of 5. Yeah, you got that one. Rob Hawk saying square peg and a round hole. The T2 connector is a round peg, for clarification, in a round hole. I actually kind of like the connector itself. Like, it's not a bad connector. it's just not very standard. So you're gonna have to buy a cable from Linum, and they're not cheap. And they also, as far as I could tell, it seems like all their cables are pretty thin. So I don't think you're gonna solve necessarily the handling problems by buying another cable from them. Big Boss saying Darth Eddie Evo is on the dark side a little bit, yeah. Felix the Phylax, good to catch your stream and looking forward to this review. Cool, glad you can make it. And yeah, it sounds like you are considering the Evo. Are there any specific things that maybe you're on the fence about that I didn't get to? And can I clarify for you? Cheeb's asking, does it have better bass than the U12T and the SA6? And so I said that the bass on the Evo is my favorite BA bass up to $2,000, specifically with the U12T in mind. The U12T is a $2,000 IM, not cheap at all. Also all balanced armature, and the bass on it is phenomenal. I don't think it really gives up anything for being BA bass. I don't think the Evo bass is quite as good as the U12T bass, so that's why I didn't say it was the best BA bass I've ever heard, but it's not too far behind. It's definitely different. Like, I think the tonal balance I actually prefer on the Evo because it's less bass. The U12T is bassier than I tend to like, but the quality of the bass, I think, just has that physical slam and attack character that you really don't get in a lot of balanced armatures, and I think the Evo does a pretty good job of it, maybe not quite as good as U12T. Versus the SA6 specifically, yes, I like the bass on the Evo better than the SA6 bass. By quite a bit, to be honest, yeah. And Omar, yes, I did say farty. It happens. Nothing to be ashamed of. Uchicha, sweet, my first ever live chat. Finally made it to one. Glad you can make it. Welcome. Rob Hawk saying Evo is quite pricey. And yeah, 500 bucks. It's a lot. Now it's down to around 420 bucks right now on Amazon, which is getting closer to where I think this thing makes sense. You know, obviously price is kind of in the eye of the beholder, how much you are willing to spend on a given earphone. It's going to be different than how much I'm personally willing to spend on a given earphone. But I would say, you know, at around like 300 bucks, like this would be pretty good compared, or pretty good, just, I guess, value in general. But that's easy to say. That's easy thing to say about a lot of things. It's like, if it was cheaper, it would be a better value. Yeah, 420 bucks is not too shabby. 500 bucks, it does feel a little bit steep, especially with this cable. I would say if you were planning on buying the Evo 2, consider getting that Linum MMCX adapter. I haven't tried it myself yet, so I don't actually know if I'm going to like it, but I'm pretty seriously considering getting it. An Element 115 saying change the filters on the Evo if they are dark for you. I'm actually pretty interested in potentially changing the filters and seeing how it affects the frequency response. What I found on the ER2XR is that it increased a little bit in the upper mid-range and a little bit in the lower treble, which I think would help the tonal balance here on the Evo, although it wouldn't address that darkness quite in the way that I would prefer. I would prefer if the darkness was addressed by having better treble extension, so that you're not accidentally, maybe inadvertently introducing any additional sharpness or unwanted forwardness in the upper mid-range. But that is a good way to cut through the darkness, and I'll definitely experiment with it now that I'm done with the review. One of the challenges with swapping the filters, and I'm not going to demonstrate the process here, but there's that little tool for screwing into the filters and pulling them out. Unfortunately, there's a pretty good chance you're going to damage the filters when you do that. So I don't think of the filters as like a thing that you can kind of play around with and like just sample the sound and then swap to another one. There's the risk that you're going to damage the filters, and they're not super expensive to replace. Like a set of them costs 30 bucks, but I don't know. It's a bit risky to replace them and potentially end up with a sound that you don't like better. So I'll play around with it now that I'm done with the review, and I've reviewed them in their stock form, which is what I usually want to do. But yeah, just that caveat with the filter stuff. And you're saying a comparison with the Moondrop hybrids would be nice. So I didn't bring in the Blessing 2, but I do have it here in hand, and it shouldn't be surprising. I did spend quite a bit of time listening to these things in comparison as well. There was just a lot of things that I wanted to talk about. So the Blessing 2 didn't quite make the cut for the comparisons in the video, but now that we're here at the Q&A section and you've asked about it, in head-to-head comparison, the level of brightness here on the Blessing 2 is very, very apparent, or the level of darkness here on the Evo is very apparent. I wouldn't necessarily describe the Blessing 2 as an especially bright IM. This is very much a neutral tuned. I mean, this is kind of the definition of my neutral tune. But the treble tuning here, I think, is much more to my liking versus the treble tuning here. I think also just the mid-range detail and stuff like that is better on the Blessing 2. Bass quality, there are some dynamic driver qualities that you get to the bass here that aren't quite, carried through here on the Evo. I don't know, honestly, if I could swap the bass, which is an impossible proposition, but if you could swap the bass from this into the Blessing 2, I don't think it would make the Blessing 2 worse. In fact, I might prefer the bass here in terms of the texture, or I don't know. Just maybe a little bit better controlled here. But for the most part, like the Blessing 2 is unreal for around $320. It's going to be really hard for anything to unseat the Blessing 2 for me, for my preferences. So yeah, for me, between these two, I would still pick the Blessing 2, but that shouldn't be too big of a surprise for folks who have watched enough of my videos where I say the Blessing 2 is still my favorite. Uchiha asking, in terms of sound, how do top-ranking TWS, true wireless IMs, like the Sony XM4s, compare to something like the Moondrop Blessing 2? Have TWS surpassed IMs in terms of sound? Or are they closing the gap? This is a difficult question to answer for a number of reasons. The biggest of which is that, like, I don't really view sound quality as like this sort of like good, better, best sort of scale. Like, it's not. There are things that sound really good, and there are things that sound really bad. And then in between, or even in the realm of good and great and like awesome sounding IMs, within that realm, there's just things that sound different, and they'll have different characteristics that may or may not appeal to you. So like the Moondrop Blessing 2 versus the XM4, the biggest difference between them is not like this sort of attempts to rank them and like scale them and like saying like this is 3 times better than that or anything like that. Like, it's not this linear thing. They're just really different in terms of their tonal balance, and that's going to be the biggest differentiator. If you want the tonal balance of the XM4, no amount of technical qualities of the Blessing 2 is going to make it sound like that. That said, and then I guess the other thing too is that the XM4 is a single dynamic driver earphone, which has certain characteristics, certain qualities that a hybrid IM like the Blessing 2 doesn't. And the Blessing 2, in contrast, has certain characteristics that a single dynamic driver doesn't. So for my personal preferences, I still prefer the Blessing 2. That shouldn't be a surprise, given I just said the Blessing 2 is like my favorite IM. But maybe another way to answer your question is that I don't think the XM4 sound quality is like limited. I don't think it's limited because it's true wireless. I think the things that keep me preferring the Blessing 2 are much more about the tonal balance. And the fact that I generally prefer hybrid IMs because I prefer that extra mid-range resolution that I tend to associate with multi-balance armature sets. So those are the reasons that I prefer the Blessing 2, and it's not because necessarily that it has a wire and that the XM4 is Bluetooth. I think if I'm just comparing the XM4 versus other single dynamic driver earphones, under 300 bucks, I think it's pretty competitive, honestly. Like, I think maybe not quite as technical as something like the JVC FDX1, but pretty different tonal balance versus something like the Tangstrom Hana 2021 or even like the Tangstrom Oxygen. They're pretty different tonally again, but maybe closer. They're a little bit in line. I don't know. I could see some reasons why the Tangstrom stuff does really exceptionally well at imaging and that separation and that 3D-ness, where the XM4 does a pretty good job of it, but I don't think quite as good. But the XM4 actually, I think, might have a little bit better mid-range detail and texture versus the Tangstrom stuff. So I think it's competitive, and I guess because of those characteristics, I don't think the Bluetooth-ness of the XM4 is a limiting factor. Nicholas Judd, thank you for all your reviews. After watching them and using the website, cool, glad you used the website. For those who are not familiar, squig.link /list probably. You went with the Blessing 2 Dusk, and they have been awesome. Great, glad to hear that they're working out for you. I'm kind of curious, Nicholas, it sounds like potentially you're somewhat new to the IEM game. I'm interested to hear from you. Did the Blessing 2 match your expectations? Maybe not necessarily in terms of like, it's as good as I expected or it's not as good as I expected, but like your conception of what that thing would sound like. Again, trying to divorce it from the scale of like good, better, best. And more just, the other aspects, like did the tonality sound like what you expected? Did it have the bass qualities that you expected? Did it have the resolution qualities that you expected? I'm curious to know about that, because that to me seems like the hardest thing to get across in both the reviews and tools like my website. Tim Baxter, another happy customer of the Blessing 2. Oh, it sounds like you just ordered them and you're looking forward to getting them. So I guess I'll pose that question to you, Tim, once you get the Blessing 2. Does it match your expectations? Swastik asking Evo versus Blessing 2 in terms of technicality. I think they're pretty comparable. I think the Blessing 2 does a better job of imaging and just sounding a little bit wider. A lot of that I'm going to attribute to the balance of treble, which is just a more neutral balance for me, whereas again the Evo comes across a little bit dark, and because of that darkness, to the way I hear sound fields, it sounds a little bit more closed in, and that's an aspect that I attribute to, or I kind of wrap into Technicalities. So I would say in terms of just like detail and mid-range texture, they're both pretty comparable, but for some of those other aspects like imaging, I think the Blessing 2 is still a step ahead. Nandu, of all three, which is a good everyday listen in terms of enjoyable ones? I mean, I'm honestly happy with the sound on all of these. I would be, if you just deleted my entire IEM library and left me with only one of these, I'd be perfectly happy, if I'm perfectly honest. The one that is the best for me is still the Moondrop Blessing 2, but if we're just talking about the Etymotics, it's tough between the ER2 and that's the ER4. Between the ER2 and the Evo, I think I prefer the sound on the Evo generally. But the fit aspects, I probably would honestly still take the ER2. Susibaka, howdy, what's up? How's it going? Felix the Phylax saying, I was curious about the comfort compared to the ER2, but you did get to it. Appreciate it. Cool. Glad I could help out with that part of your decision making. Sussy, I do not plan on reviewing the TRN MT1. $10 for two of them. What the heck? Holy moly. Rob Hawk asking, which moondrop is it most like? I assume you're asking about the Evo. Which moondrop is the Evo most like? That's an interesting question. I would say it's still probably most comparable to the Blessing 2, but it is darker. And so I can't really think of a moondrop that to me sounds like the Blessing 2, but a little bit darker. So I'm going to say that these are the closest equivalents. Abel Santiago is saying Etymotic design is not a looker. And I don't know. Yeah, I think I take it that the build quality on the Evo is quite nice. Again, it's got like that really solid metal feel. I like the color. I think it's handsome. But the shape is, I don't know. It seems a little accidental. And then the Eddy branding on here is, that's pretty bare bones. The Blessing 2, I think, is, in comparison, a little bit more exciting and interesting to look at. This cable is not the stock cable, just for clarification. But yeah, I guess I'm not a big fan of the Blessing 2 text on there as well. But I would agree that the Blessing 2 is a nicer look. Juan, nice to see you there, but I'm not going to be able to repeat your comment on air. Keeping it safe for work. Warhead steel. That cable is a hair's width, and yes, I guess now that I have these other IMs in comparison, you can take a look. Look, this is the ER2 cable, and this is a cable that is pretty unanimously described as a very thin, wiry cable. And you can see in comparison to the Evo cable, it's still about twice as thick, maybe 3 times as thick as the ER2 cable, just to show how thin this is. And then of course, this is pure chonker. This is absurdity, but I love it. And there you go. There's your comparison of absurdity versus the ER2 cable. It's very thin, but I've said that before. Yeah, Element 115, I see you saying that that Knowles makes filters that I believe also fit into these earphones, and they are made of metal, so they're probably more durable than the Etymotic stuff. I'm not certain that they're tuned necessarily the same. Maybe I should check those out though, just as a science experiment. That should be worth it. Element 115 saying thanks for the comparison. I have the old ER4S and have the Blessing 2. Curious what you would think about the ER4S versus the Blessing 2, because the ER4S, that is like Etymotic's, it's not their original earphone, but that tuning is kind of like their original neutral tuning. I find it a little bit bass light for my preferences, but it's still pretty satisfying. Listen. Metal 571 back in the chat. What's up? Nice to see you there as well. You were saying I'm gonna have a hard time choosing something other than the SA6 in this price range, so around $500. But then again, I have I've heard barely any IMs compared to the Pro. So yeah, the SA6 is a really good pick at around $500, especially if you're interested in specifically an all balanced armature set. I didn't compare it here because the tuning is a little bit different. It's a different version of neutral, whereas all of these kind of have a more in common in terms of the tuning. But the SA6 is definitely a very competitive IM at around the same price. I think also you got to consider things like the Dunu EST112, which actually I think, Metal, you're not a big fan of. Very, very different tune from these, so maybe I shouldn't bring that one into the conversation. But at that price range, I think it's pretty competitive. And then there's also the Moondrop Variations, which honestly might be the best sounding of the bunch. But it's only like a little bit better sounding than like the Moondrop Blessing 2 or the Dusk, and it does cost quite a bit more. So that's why, for me, the Blessing 2 is still kind of my go-to. But the Variations for $520, it does make the $500 on the Eddy a little bit hard to swallow, honestly. But yeah, Metal, I'd be interested in. Hopefully you can get a hold of the Variations and getting your take on that one. Although if you've heard the Dusk, you've just about heard the Variations. Uchiha saying, in lieu of my prior question, I have the Blessing 2 because of your reviews, and they're my favorite of my 6 or 7 IEMs. The clarity is amazing, and I love the customization. I'm considering to buy my first true wireless. Okay, interesting. So the XM4, I think you were the one that mentioned the XM4 before. It's pretty good. It's pretty dang good, but it's going to be very different in terms of its tuning than your Blessing. You know, it does have the built-in EQ, so potentially you could kind of finesse it into something that sounds a little bit more like Blessing 2. But I don't know. I would not expect to be able to make it sound like your Blessing 2. It's going to sound warmer, more laid back. Still somewhat on the mid-range focus, so I quite respect the tuning on the XM4, but it's going to be very different. It's also kind of pricey. What is it, like $300? Which I say that just because in the true wireless space, the Samsung Galaxy Buds Plus are another of my favorites, and that's now like pretty available for under $100. And if I were buying a true wireless IM for myself, spending my own money, not that I haven't spent my own money on these, but just buying one for myself to listen to music on, I would probably still go with the Galaxy Buds Plus. I think I prefer the sound on the XM4s generally, but for the price to performance ratio in the of the Galaxy Buds Plus, given like how often I listen to true wireless IMs, I think it makes more sense for me. Non-min, bruh, late again. That's okay. That's all right. We'll catch up in Discord. Shenzai, same to you. Still catching up with chat here, and I will warn you too. I'm starting to lose my voice. My throat's getting a little bit dry from all this talking, so I might have to wrap this one up, but let me get to the questions as best as possible. Darkness Deep, greetings from Brazil. How's it going? I would like to thank you and the people at Discord for the tips you got on the Blessing 2. Yours don't hurt anymore. Got it for awesome. Wow, another happy Blessing 2. This is going to become the Blessing 2 channel. I'm just going to go ahead and rename the channel. Go ahead and rename the Discord server to Cost KSC75 and Moondrop Blessing 2. Metal 571, I see you mentioning the Yincrow RW9. Curious, I'd be interested in your take on the Yincrow stuff. Juan asking, is the connector still keyed? So, clarification here on this T2 cable. I believe it is not keyed, right? I can rotate it around. It does not appear to care which direction it goes in. I don't know, it's a little bit small. I don't have a macro lens here. But yeah, that will go in pretty much any direction you would like it to. Santiago saying the Blessing 2 cable is dropping some drip though. Yeah, I think, again, this is not the stock cable, but it's pretty handsome. And for those who maybe are interested in picking up this cable, I don't have a link in the description, but just go to AliExpress and type in XINHS. That's the shop that makes this cable. It costs around, I want to say $60, so not super cheap, but if you've looked around at cables on AliExpress, you know that you can definitely spend a lot more than $60. So I felt that $60 is a pretty fair price for this beauty of a cable. Let me go ahead and unfurl it so we can enjoy. We're just gonna do cable porn. Yeah, that's a nice one. Nicholas, you had bought the Blessing 2, and I asked you for your take on if it met your expectations. You're saying your experience with headphones had been the M50X, the Audio-Technica, very popular headphone. Not my favorite. And when I went with the Blessing 2, it was really nice hearing a ton of sounds that normally were washed out by the bass in the M50X. It sounds like about what I would expect. You also have a pair of KZ ZS10 Pros that you enjoy, but you got them right before you got the Blessing, so you haven't spent as much time with them, which I would also expect because of how good the Blessing 2 is. DCIJK asking, am I planning to review the Thea Audio Excalibur? I'd be very interested in reviewing it, but I don't have any plans at this moment. That is definitely one that I would love to hear. Oh, and you hit me up with the super chat asking about the Excalibur and the EST versus the variations. Yeah, that would be a comparison I would love to do, but I don't have the Excalibur on hand, so at this point it's going to have to wait. And I think so there's the Oracle and the Excalibur, sort of like the two Thea Audio tribrids at that price. I forget which is the one that I think I would be more interested in. I thought it was the Oracle, which might be a little bit more neutral tuned, but I could be wrong about that one. Abel Santiago asking what would be my top 3 IMs below $100. Check out squig.link/rank. You can filter the list by price range, so you can filter it to under $100, and then you can take a look at all the IMs that I've rated 4 stars, 5 stars in that price range. I mean, the short version of my favorite IMs under $100 is going to be like the Etymotic ER2XR, which is one of the IMs we had on this table, the Moondrop SSR or the Stardust, and then number 3 choice might be something like the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus, but I don't know. I think I would really recommend checking out the tool that I've built, because it's going to give you a little bit more extra detail. You can dive into the reviews of them if you want, but also compare it to some other IMs that I think are similarly good but might have different sound signatures that may or may not be more to your liking. Yeah, Metal, definitely hope to get your impressions on the variations one day. There's been so many IMs come out just in like the past, I want to say 4 or 5 months. Really hard to keep up with, honestly. Oh, and then Metal571, your take on the Yin Crow. You said, I actually thought it was great for an earbud, just because it has some semblance of bass extension. Quite warm for me, which is okay, but unfortunately can't wear it for very long. Kind of scratchy. Is that just like an effect of the foam ear tips, which I can understand. I know the scratchiness of like even something like the Grado SR80 can be an issue, and kind of doubly so when you have it actually sitting inside of your ear bowl. Vitor Machado saying, I barely got the Aria and I'm already looking into the Blessing 2. Yeah, this is a deadly game, this whole IM stuff. I think the Blessing 2 is quite a bit better than the Aria, but they're pretty different too. There's going to be some people that would actually prefer the Aria. So just to set your expectations. And then Brett asking, around $400 would the Blessing 2 be the best option for a mid-focused IM? Yes, yes. I'm always, if your price range includes up to $300, I'm pretty much always going to recommend the Blessing 2. And Nonmin, I'm not familiar with the Kato. Maybe hit me with a link to that one on the Discord, but otherwise, like I said, throat's getting a little bit dry. I'm going to go ahead and cut this one short. So thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for watching. And again, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button down below. It really does help me out. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already, but if you're hanging around now, you're probably subscribed. And if you've dinged the bell, I'll catch you in the next super review. Have a good weekend. Cheers.